The envelope arrived on a Tuesday, which was the kind of detail Kwabena probably thought didn't matter. He had always been careless about small things: the day of the week, the weight of words, the people standing just behind the frame when photographs were taken. He slid the card under Layla's door at the Meridian Group's Toronto offices, left it with the front receptionist as though it were routine correspondence, as though the cream-colored cardstock and the embossed gold lettering were not designed to deliver a very specific message, as though he had not spent 15 minutes with his assistant workshopping exactly how the delivery should feel. Layla Oduya picked it up on her way out of a board meeting. She read it in the elevator. She read it again in the underground parking garage, standing beside her car in her coat, the engine still off, the overhead fluorescent lights humming in that particular way they do in parkades across the country at 7 in the evening when everyone else has already gone home. The card invited her to the launch gala for Kwabena's new venture fund, the Harrow Capital Inaugural Gala, Saturday, April 12th, the Shangri-La Hotel, Toronto, black tie. At the bottom, in his handwriting, not printed, handwritten, which meant he had touched the card, were 4 words. Wouldn't miss it, right? She stood there for a moment longer than she needed to. Then she put the card in her bag, got into the car, and drove north on Bay Street with the radio off. Kwabena Asare had started Harrow Capital with 2 other partners, and a client list that Layla had, in the 4 years they were together, helped him build one conversation at a time. She had been the one to introduce him to the partners at Northgate Ventures. She had been the one to quietly resolve the regulatory filing issue in 2019 that would have ended his previous firm before it ever reached its 2nd fiscal year. She had been the one to show up to every dinner, every reception, every gray Saturday morning, spent networking at charity golf tournaments in Oakville, standing at Kwabena's side in whichever dress he'd suggested she wear, making conversation with the right people, remembering the names of their children, sending handwritten notes after the fact because she understood what those gestures meant in the rooms where serious money was discussed. She had done all of it because she loved him. And then, 18 months ago, he had sat across from her at the kitchen table in the house they shared in Forest Hill and told her he thought they wanted different things. He had said it the way people say such things when they have already decided and are only narrating the conclusion. Calm, almost formal, as though the relationship had been a business that had reached the natural end of its operating cycle. 6 weeks after that, she had seen a photograph on a mutual friend's Instagram. Kwabena at a restaurant in Yorkville. A woman beside him, younger, laughing at something he'd said, her hand on his forearm, the way a person's hand rests when they are not thinking about how it looks. Layla had closed the app and set her phone face down on the counter and stood in her kitchen for a while. Then she had gotten back to work. What Kwabena did not know, what he could not have known, because he had stopped paying attention to her the moment she was no longer useful to him, was what Layla had done with those 18 months. She had always had the idea. It had lived in a folder on her laptop for years, a business plan she had written in pieces late at night, and on weekends quietly, the way a person tends a garden in a back corner of a yard that nobody else visits. The concept was a software platform that helped mid-sized Canadian companies manage their ESG reporting obligations, environmental, social, governance disclosures that had become increasingly complicated as regulatory requirements expanded and institutional investors demanded more transparency. It was unglamorous work to think about. It was exactly the kind of problem that was genuinely important and almost completely ignored by the flashier corners of the tech world. She had called it Clearpath. She had incorporated it 14 months ago, in February, in a lawyer's office on King Street West, sitting across from a junior partner named O.C. Hammond, who shook her hand and said he hoped the business went well and clearly meant it as a formality. It had not stayed a formality. By the end of the first year, Clearpath had signed contracts with 11 mid-market clients across Ontario and Alberta. By the following spring, which was, though Layla had not planned it this way, the same spring Kwabena sent the card. Clearpath had 23 active clients, had closed a Series A round of $4 million from two institutional investors, and had been named one of the top 20 Canadian technology startups. To watch by a national business publication that Kwabena read every single week on his phone during his morning commute. He had not made the connection. Or perhaps he had, and the invitation was a response to it. Layla was never entirely sure which was worse. She had told her best friend Ogechi about the card over the phone that same Tuesday evening, sitting on her couch in her apartment in Leslieville, with a cup of tea going cold on the table. He handwrote a note, Ogechi said. Not a question. 4 words. There was a pause. He wants you to watch. Yes, are you going? Layla looked out the window at the street below. April in Toronto. Still too cold. The buds on the trees not quite ready. I haven't decided. What's to decide? Everything, Layla said. And also nothing. Ogechi understood. That was the thing about a friendship that had lasted since the second year of undergrad at Western. You did not always need to translate. Ogechi had been there for the beginning of Kwabena, the middle, the quiet, devastating end. She had also watched Layla build Clearpath from a folder of notes into something real, something that mattered, something that other people were now paying attention to. If you go, Ogechi said, don't go alone. The Shangri-La on University Avenue was the kind of hotel that made a particular kind of statement. The lobby alone communicated things about money and taste and access that required no narration. On the evening of April 12th, the hotel had arranged the gala in the main ballroom, which opened through glass onto a terrace that looked south across the lights of downtown Toronto. The CN Tower in the background doing what it always did, which was make everything feel more significant than it might otherwise. Kwabena arrived early, the way men arrive when they are the hosts and want to be seen receiving their guests rather than searching for them. He was wearing a tuxedo that had been custom-made for him in London. He had mentioned this to 3 different people before the evening had properly begun. His new partner, a woman named Blythe, who worked in private equity and had the kind of composed, deliberate beauty that suggested both good genetics and considerable effort, stood beside him in the receiving line, holding a glass of champagne with the ease of someone who had been to many such evenings. He watched the door. He was not sure why he watched the door, only that he did. Layla arrived at 40 minutes past 7. She did not arrive the way he had imagined she might. Tentatively, with the particular quality of someone who has accepted an invitation they are not sure about and wanted to slip in without being noticed. She arrived the way she arrived everywhere now, which was the way a person arrives when they have learned, through considerable and private suffering, that the room does not get to decide what they are worth. She was wearing a deep garnet dress, long, with a structured shoulder that had the effect of making her seem both formal and completely at ease inside the formality. She had cut her hair shorter than she'd worn it when they were together. It suited her in a way that the previous length had not. A thing Kwabena noticed immediately and which unsettled him in a way he would not have been able to articulate even to himself. 2 people walked in just behind her. They were not bodyguards in any theatrical or obvious sense. They were colleagues. The man in the dark suit was her head of operations, a former Bay Street lawyer named Theron, who had left a partnership at a major firm to join Clearpath 8 months ago, which was itself a statement that people in this room would recognize as significant. The woman beside him was Priyanka, Clearpath's VP of Client Relations, who had previously led enterprise sales at a software company that had been acquired for $280 million and whose face was known to roughly half the people in the ballroom. They walked in as a unit, not performing, simply present. Kwabena saw them. He felt something move through him that he chose to interpret as surprise, but which was, at its core, something closer to the specific and disorienting sensation of having miscalculated. He had thought, when he'd written those 4 words on the card, that he was being clever. He had thought the invitation was the kind of move that allowed you to close a chapter on your own terms, to let someone see exactly how far you had come since they had been part of your life. He had thought Layla would arrive quietly, would find herself at a table, somewhere on the perimeter, would watch him receive congratulations, and handle the room with the ease of a man at the peak of things, and would leave at the end of the evening with a particular understanding about the distance between where he was and where she had ended up. He had, in the language he used when assessing portfolio companies, completely misread the fundamentals. The first indication that the evening was not going to unfold as planned came 45 minutes into cocktail hour, when Layla was standing near the bar with Theron and Priyanka, and a man named Gordon Ellery, one of the senior partners at the largest pension fund in Ontario, a man whose approval Kwabena had been courting for the better part of 14 months, crossed the room to speak to her. Kwabena watched from across the ballroom. He saw Gordon Ellery reach for Layla's hand with both of his. He saw the body language of the greeting, which was not polite introduction, but the specific warmth of two people who already knew each other well. He saw Layla smile, the real one, the one that changed her whole face and that Kwabena had once believed he was the only person who could produce in her. He excused himself from the conversation he was having and moved, without appearing to move with any particular urgency, toward the far side of the room. He arrived at the bar in time to hear Gordon Ellery say, with the particular satisfaction of a man who believes he is ahead of the market, "Our investment committee approved the third-party engagement. You'll have the formal letter by the end of next week." Layla said, "That means a great deal. Thank you, Gordon. We've been waiting for something like Clearpath for years, honestly. The reporting burden alone is, well, you understand it better than I do." Kwabena inserted himself into the edges of the conversation with a smile that cost him something. "Gordon, good to see you." Gordon Ellery turned, the warmth recalibrated. The greeting he gave Kwabena was professional and correct. "Kwabena, congratulations on the launch. Looking forward to hearing more about the fund thesis tonight." He turned back to Layla. "Will you be at the Rotman panel in June?" "I'm moderating it," Layla said. Gordon smiled. "Of course you are." Kwabena found her later, during the interval between the cocktail hour and the formal dinner, when people were moving toward their tables and the event staff were beginning the process of reordering the room. He found her near the windows that looked out over the city, standing with a glass of sparkling water, looking south. "Layla." She turned. Her expression was the kind that carries no residue of old feeling, not cold, not warm, simply present. A person looking at another person they once knew. "Kwabena." She said his name the way someone says a city they used to live in. "Congratulations on the fund. Thank you." He stood a moment too long without anything to follow that. He was used to leading conversations, to setting the pace and the register of an exchange. With Layla, tonight, he found himself without a clear opening. "You've been busy." "I have. Clearpath," he said. The word felt strange in his mouth, like something he should have known earlier than he did. "Yes, I read the piece in the Globe. I saw that edition." He looked at her. The room moved around them, the sound of 100 people finding seats, the low note of a piano starting somewhere, the kind of ambient wealth that used to be their shared context. "I didn't know you were this far along," he said. Layla considered the statement. She could have said many things. She had thought about this conversation, or a version of it, several times over the past 18 months. Not obsessively, but honestly, the way you think about a thing you know, you will eventually face and want to be prepared for. She had thought about what she might say to convey the specific quality of the experience of having been underestimated by someone who once claimed to know her completely. What she said was, "You wouldn't have. You stopped looking." He didn't answer. There was no good answer. She was not wrong. "The note on the card," she said, after a moment. Those 4 words. He looked away from her toward the window. "I think you invited me because you thought I needed to be reminded of something," Layla said. "I think you thought the evening would clarify certain things for me. Where you'd ended up, where I'd ended up." She paused. "I'm not angry about that. I think it tells me something I'd already understood, but it's useful to have it confirmed." "That's not," he started. "Kwabena." She said his name quietly and without unkindness. I built a company. I have 23 clients, 4 million in Series A funding, and as of 20 minutes ago, a third-party engagement with Westfield Pension. She watched something move across his face. Gordon and I met at a climate finance summit in Ottawa last October. He came to us. The piano continued behind them. Someone laughed at a table nearby. The CN Tower held its position in the southern sky, indifferent and illuminated. I'm glad you're doing well, he said. He meant it, she thought. He also could not fully separate that gladness from the discomfort of having contributed so little to it. I know you are, she said, and then, because she was not cruel, but also no longer interested in managing his comfort. I'm going to go find my table. She walked back into the room. Theron was already seated, talking with someone to his left. Priyanka had found two people she knew from a previous industry event, and was in the middle of what looked like a genuinely interesting conversation. The table card at Layla's seat had been placed, at her quiet request, through the event coordinator, near the windows, which meant that for the entire dinner she would have a view of the city at night, which was a thing she had always found steadying. She sat down. She picked up the menu and read it without urgency. Across the room, Kwabena returned to his table at the front, where Blythe was already seated and where the evening's program was about to begin. He sat down. He looked out at the room that he had assembled, the investors and partners and industry contacts who had come to celebrate what he was building. He looked at the room and tried to locate within himself the specific feeling he had anticipated having, the satisfaction of a man at the top of a game he believes he has already won. He found something else instead. He was not entirely certain what to call it. The program began at 8:30. The co-founder of a major Canadian technology accelerator gave remarks. Two of Harrow Capital's portfolio founders were introduced and said brief, grateful things. Kwabena spoke for 12 minutes about the fund's thesis, which centered on scaling Canadian companies that were solving real infrastructure problems, and he was good at it. There was no question about that. He was articulate and confident, and he understood the room, and when he finished, the applause was genuine. 3 tables to his right and back, Layla clapped with everyone else. What happened next was not something anyone had planned or anticipated, and it was not dramatic in the way of a confrontation or a revelation. It was the kind of thing that happens at events like this, when the professional world is small enough, and the relevant work is visible enough. During the open networking period after dinner, a woman named Frances Whitmore, a reporter from a national business publication who covered Canadian technology and had been covering Clearpath since the Series A announcement, found Layla near the terrace doors and asked if she had a few minutes. Frances had been at the Gala to cover Harrow Capital's launch, but she had not known Layla would be present, and the presence of Layla Oduya and 2 of her senior team at a gala that was ostensibly about something else had piqued her interest. They talked for 11 minutes. Layla spoke about the third-party engagement with Westfield, which was now confirmed and public. She spoke about Clearpath's expansion into British Columbia, which was scheduled for the fall. She spoke about the gap in the market that Clearpath was addressing and why it mattered and what the next 18 months looked like. Frances took notes on her phone. At the end, almost as an aside, she asked, "Were you and Kwabena Asare previously?" "We were," Layla said, simply, without drama. "And you're here tonight." "I was invited," Layla said, and there was something in the way she said it that made Frances pause her notes app and look up. Layla was not smiling, but her expression held a kind of steadiness that Frances would describe, in the piece she filed the following Thursday, as the particular composure of someone who had decided, entirely on their own terms, what the story was going to be about. The piece ran online on Thursday morning under the headline, "The Quiet Builder: How Layla Oduya Turned a Back-Channel Idea into One of Canada's Most Watched ESG Startups." It was 4,000 words. It began with the Westfield announcement. It mentioned the gala. It mentioned, briefly and factually, that Layla had attended the Harrow Capital launch gala at the Shangri-La, and that several senior investors present had sought her out during the evening in connection with Clearpath's growing portfolio. It did not frame this as remarkable. That was the most remarkable thing about it. Kwabena read it on his phone at 7:45 in the morning while standing in his kitchen. He read it twice. The second time, he paid particular attention to a section near the end in which Francis had asked Layla what she wished. She had understood earlier about building something from nothing. Layla had said that the people who underestimate you are not the obstacle. They're the proof that you were already working on something they hadn't thought to look for yet. He set his phone down on the counter. Through the kitchen window, the April morning was gray and mild, the particular gray of Toronto in the middle of spring, when the season has not quite committed. A streetcar passed somewhere below. Somewhere in the city, in an office in Leslieville that he had never visited, a team of people was arriving to work on a problem that he had watched being built from inside a life they'd shared and had not recognized for what it was. He did not call her. He was not sure what he would have said. Ogechi read the piece at her desk in her office in Hamilton and texted Layla a single line at 9:12 that morning. They always look right when you stop needing them to. Layla was in a meeting with the Clearpath development team when the text arrived. She felt her phone vibrate, glanced at the screen, and felt something move through her that was not triumph and not vindication, and not any of the things she might have expected to feel at the moment when the version of events she had lived privately was finally the version that other people could read. It was quieter than that. It was the specific feeling of having done the work and then watched the work speak without needing her to explain it. She set her phone face down on the table and looked back at the screen at the front of the room, where her head of product was walking through a deployment timeline for the new client onboarding module. "Where were we?" she said. They continued. Later, much later, weeks after the piece had cycled through the business press and been shared among the particular networks that paid attention to such things. Layla drove out to Scarborough on a Sunday morning to have breakfast with her mother. Her mother, Kwabena, lived in the same house on Kingston Road, where Layla had grown up, in a neighborhood that had changed and stayed the same in the particular way neighborhoods do when they are old enough to have accumulated multiple generations of stories. The kitchen smelled of fried plantain and Earl Grey tea. The table was set with the placemats Layla remembered from childhood, the ones with the pattern of autumn leaves that had faded now, to the point where the leaves were more suggestion than image. Her mother put a plate in front of her and sat down across from her and did not mention the article, which was something Layla appreciated. She had called the week it ran, said I read it. "I'm proud of you. I always knew you were building something," and then moved on, because she understood instinctively that her daughter did not need the accomplishment narrated back to her. She needed breakfast and company, and the particular quality of silence that only exists in the house where you grew up. They ate. They talked about Abina's garden, which was coming back after the winter. They talked about a neighbor's renovation that had been ongoing since the previous autumn. They talked about small things, the kind that pile up into a life when you're not looking. At some point, washing her cup at the sink, Layla looked out the kitchen window at the backyard. The apple tree her father had planted when she was 7 was in the early stages of what looked like a reasonable year. Buds on most of the branches, not yet blossoms, just the beginning of the signal that something was coming. She thought about Kwabena, briefly, the way you think about a chapter in a book you finished reading a while ago. You remember it. You can still locate the shape of it, but it does not pull at you the way it did when you were inside it. She thought about the Gala. She thought about the terrace doors, and the city lights, and the particular expression on Kwabena's face when he'd said, "I didn't know you were this far along." She thought about what it meant that his understanding of where she was had remained fixed. At the moment he decided she was no longer worth paying attention to. She thought about how long she had been moving while he was looking elsewhere. She turned off the tap. She dried her hands on the towel hanging beside the sink, the one with the faded embroidery at the edge that her mother had owned for as long as Layla could remember. Her mother was behind her somewhere, moving through the house with the unhurried efficiency of a woman who had lived in the same space for 38 years and knew every inch of it. "Do you want more tea?" Kwabena called. "Yes," Layla said. She looked out the window a moment longer. The apple tree stood in the April light, small and unassuming, the way it had always stood, the way it had stood through every season, without being asked about it. It bloomed when it was ready. It had always bloomed when it was ready. And the people who happened to be in the yard when it did were not the reason it had bloomed. They were simply the ones who happened to be standing there. She turned away from the window and went to find her cup.